start, I would love to do an acknowledgement of country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, Bloom Impact Investing acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. How appropriate for today. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Thank you. So welcome everyone. My name is Camille. I am the director and founder of Bloom Impact Investing. I'm also the director of this meetup group called Impact Investing and Sustainable Finance. So why are we here? And what am I, why did I create this group? So I'm on a mission to allow people to learn more about impact investing and to empower investors to access sustainable returns while making a difference. See, I am particularly passionate about climate change, and I see a world where we create a carbon-free economy, allowing people and the planet to thrive. So I work hard to make impact investing easy to access and more engaging via these webinars. But enough about me. Part of this mission is to propel the voices of experts in this field, like Fiachra today. And we want to propel those voices far and wide. And it is therefore with great pleasure that today I am inviting Fiachra to share his knowledge on natural capital with us today. So I will quickly introduce him so that you all have an understanding of his background and how wonderful his work is. So Fiachra is the CEO of Forever Wild. Forever Wild is an Australian-based charity launched in 2018. But it's a charity with a really bold vision spanning centuries yet to come for nature and human society. Forever Wild is truly unique and is building innovative partnerships and investment programs worldwide to create vast shared earth reserves that are ecologically, politically, and socially sustainable. In other words, we are really, really lucky to have Fiachra today because natural capital is a nascent field and a lot has to be done to define how this industry works. So we really, really appreciate Fiachra's time today. Before I let Fiachra do his presentation, I'll quickly do some housekeeping. So please note this event is being recorded. The webinar will be made available to the attendees after the event. But fear not, unless you unmute yourself and speak, your video won't show on the recording. So don't be shy and let your video on and let your beautiful smile shine through the screen today. You can ask questions throughout the event by typing in the chat. Please indicate if you'd like me to ask on your behalf or if you're happy to ask the question yourself. And we'll keep 10 to 15 minutes at the end so you can directly chat to Fiachra. So without further ado, let me invite Fiachra to share his screen. I will make you a host now. And also a warm welcome to all our new members. The group keeps growing and it's really, really great to see new faces and familiar faces as well. So Fiachra, you should be a host now. Please let me know if you can share your screen.
Yeah, it looks like I can. Yeah. Right. Okay, there's some pretty big expectations there, Camille.
I'm sure you'll live up to it.
Yeah, look, you know, this is, I'm kind of looking at a lot of names on the screen and not many faces, but that's okay. I'll do my best to try and talk sense to the laptop. This I'd like to thank Camille. This is great, an interesting opportunity to have this discussion. I think, you know, as you said, this is an important topic, and despite the fact that it's been around for years and years and years, we have still yet to figure out a way to manage the tension between the economic systems and the natural systems that we have on this planet. And I'll go through a few concepts, you know, about you know effectively what underpins Forever Wild. And I've got a few slides to share, and I'm sort of using, you know, I'll use a couple of examples from the work that we're doing and how we're viewing this particular topic. And I think, you know, I'm sort of happy to take any pressing questions, but I think given the fact that there's just lots of names on the screen, it might be easier, like Camille said, if we sort of do it at the end. And I think if there are people waiting, I'm supposed to let them in, but we'll see how they go. Hopefully I can manage multitask. Right. Okay, so what I'm going to cover today, a little bit, I got some notes here, but I see you looking down. Before I start the slides, I'm going to cover just, you know, just a general description of what natural capital is, and it is very general, and this is a big field. I mean, the whole area of impact investing is an enormous field, and really, Forever Wild is focused on one specific area, and that's how to think about the natural world and how to leverage that in different ways to both protect that world and to support the expectations of human society. And clearly, it's an important time, and we have to figure this out. We haven't yet figured it out at scale. Forever Wild is attempting to do that. I'm not going to say it's a silver bullet, and certainly when you see as I go through the presentation, there are several really important ways to think about natural capital. But we've got to be able to do it at scale, and that is something we have not yet been able to achieve. And I think, you know, again, because of the tensions between the economic expectations and the natural system expectations, that's one of the problems there. What are the opportunities? There are some very clear opportunities. What are the challenges? What do we need to consider around investment models when we're talking about different types of natural capital? And you know, what are some of the returns? You know, we're in a situation, I think, at the moment, and having spoken to several impact investing companies over the last couple of years, quite frankly, a lot of the expectations driven by investors. You know, the return on investment is a driving force rather than the return on impact. And that is a real challenge that we have to address. And it's going to take someone with a little bit of courage to step up and to make sure that we implement the right models for the right form of natural capital. And I want to be clear that when we're talking about impact investing, you know, we're really talking about what's broadly classed as ESG investment. So that is, you know, environmental, social, and governance considerations around that investment, and what is the impact of that. I suppose the other term you could use, you know, that doesn't fit into that, is your sort of traditional investments, and they tend to really focus only on return on the initial capital. But I understand that there's a spectrum in there. You know, I don't want to sort of get into discussing impact investing as such. There is a spectrum, we recognize that. And maybe those who are familiar with impact investing will see, as I go through the presentation, where some of that spectrum sits naturally. So let me see if I can start my screen. Radio, a couple. All right, let's see how that goes. Right, is that shared?
Yes, I can see your screen. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Right, well, hopefully I can actually get the slides to work as well. So step one, success, right? I'm online. Okay, so, you know, what are we looking at? Really, we need to really think about our future. I mean, you know, I'm not going to stand here and lecture people. I think every reasonably sane person on this earth recognizes that we have to find a new way to live on this planet. You know, when I say a new way, let me be clear. We used to live well with our planet, but perhaps not so much anymore. So perhaps it's sort of, maybe the better term is just to redefine how how modern society, contemporary society can use our economic systems and the expectations of people, but also prepare, be prepared to find the balance. So I've got this slide up. And really an investor who's interested in ESG needs to understand that natural capital is diverse. It is not a single class of investing. It covers multiple different forms, and therefore it requires a couple of different investment models. I think one of the challenges is that those investment models are not yet well defined. And I think there's definitely scope for impact investing firms to really think about how they, what is their objective? What is it that they want to achieve? If they really want to achieve impact, what is the investment model to do so? Not just what is the outcome of the product. And I'll explain more about how the tension between the models can become quite a problem. I like this picture. I put this picture up because this is a photograph we took in Western Australia earlier this year. And it's interesting when you show this picture to different people with different perspectives, they all see something different. I think this is really fundamental. If you show that to a pastoralist, or agricultural specialist, one of the things that comes out, and we work with all these people, so I have actually done this, is, look at this, fantastic. There's water, there's soil, there's vegetation. The water is obviously critical. That there's agricultural potential in that landscape. So that is a form of natural capital that supports agriculture. But then you get other perspectives. It's a pretty spectacular image. The lake itself is absolutely beautiful. It fills up once every 5 to 10 years. And it's a freshwater lake. It's got great tourism potential, fantastic photography potential. It also has water, which is a tradable commodity. So we can sell that. You think of that simply as an asset. In that single picture, in that one landscape, there are multiple ways to generate revenue. Some of those ways are very extractive. They don't really put anything back. They're not part of any sort of cyclical economic thinking. Some of them are more integrated into that capital. So I really like that picture. It's a great one. Plus, it's a beautiful picture. If we invest correctly in natural capital, it can be transformational. And it's a very simple thing. I mean, we know that the life support systems on our planet are, the ecological systems that surround us. And we now have a whole branch of science, which is around planetary systems, trying to understand the entire complex arena of our planet and how it interacts and how we interact with it. Some of that is driven by, the changing climate. But generally, it is a growing area of science for a number of reasons, including off-Earth exploration. But if we want to really understand and transform the long-term future of our society, I strongly believe we have to understand the natural capital. We have to do it in a way which links in with one of the other key systems of human society. That is our economic system. I want to be clear that it's not the only way. Natural capital is a somewhat contentious term, actually, because there's a philosophical position that we should not look at these systems in any through an economic lens. These systems are life support systems. We have a moral duty and a self-preservation duty to protect them. I'm not really here to discuss that. I don't disagree with that. But the reality is we're not doing it. We're not doing it well. And one of the reasons we're not doing it is because our financial drivers, which human beings largely equate to quality of life, and it does drive a lot of our expectations in society, is a problem. It really is a large tension between that. We're not going to give that up, but we still require the life support system to keep going. And a simple example of that, where we're working in Western Australia, and I'll give a bit more of an example of that case as we go on. In Western Australia, in the Gascoyne Murchison areas, there's been long-term, multi-generational degradation of the natural resource. And what's happened is that the natural resource has been used for grazing, been overgrazed. Before we really understood that natural resource, we've degraded it progressively. we're now at a point where that natural system can no longer support many of those communities. And yet, there's people who still own or have the rights to that natural capital still have to pay their bank debt. So the bank will demand, this is quite a simple explanation, but it is real. The bank will demand that their repayments are met. And to do that, the economic system is overriding the needs of the ecological system. The system goes into droughts, it goes through its natural ecological cycles. It doesn't necessarily match with the economic expectations. So we're really trying to force these two systems together. And this is where the investment model around natural capital becomes incredibly important. And the expectations of both have to be met.
Fiachra, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Thank you, great thoughts. Can you please define for the audience natural capital before we dive in further?
I'm just about to do that. Yeah.
Oh,
so
go for it.
So natural capital. So I've actually got a slide coming up which actually shows lots of different forms of natural capital. And Australia has a vast areas. We look at the whole continent of natural capital. We want to try and protect it. People live on it. We make, it integrates with us as a society, but we have to rethink how to engage with it. So what is natural capital? So it's actually quite a lot. We often, in conversations that I've had, natural capital is distilled down to some quite simple things. We look at landscapes, we look at how landscapes contribute to agriculture, and we consider that form of natural capital. And there certainly are, you certainly can define natural capital in very clear, unambiguous ways if you take that approach. Solar can be defined as natural capital. I'll also say that you could argue that mining mineral resources is natural capital. But I'm not really here to discuss that particular form of natural capital because it's very much extractive. It doesn't really contribute to any sort of positive cycle around the Earth systems. But nonetheless, quite frankly, the planet provides huge amounts of resources for us. But here's the interesting thing. I've got some pictures up there. We've got a landscape there in the middle. We've got solar panels, and solar is obviously a pretty important part of natural capital. But we've also got things which are sort of indirect. So there's indigenous arts and well-being and cultural connections to landscapes, all of which also interact with tourism. And I guess what I'm saying here is that you can think of natural capital as an asset. So we can think of land, and we often do, as an asset. In many legal senses, it is an asset. You buy it, you sell it. But that asset, interestingly enough, also is a form of capital. And this is where some of the disconnect in the lexicon has to be addressed. So if you think about the landscape, if you look around that slide, everything apart from the seaweed maybe in the ocean, but everything else there is actually fixed into that landscape or can be attributed to that landscape. In many ways, that landscape can be thought of as capital. And capital is really, if you think about it from a finance point of view, is like a liquid fund or a cash fund that we use to generate more wealth. If we think of the land only as an asset, we are there to exploit that asset. We want to spend that asset or manage it in a way that gives us a direct business unit on top of that asset. If we think of it as a fund, we think of the landscape and the capital as capital, as a fund, we can think much more broadly about everything that fund can do. And if if I'm an investment fund manager, I'm given a pool of money, I want to go out there and get returns for the investors. And so I will think creatively about what's working from an investment point of view, what's the current market situation, what's producing which returns, and we'll build a whole portfolio. In essence, if we really want to think about natural capital in the right way, certainly whether it's going to be an asset or capital, we have to think about it in that way. We have to think about what that land can do. And one of the key principles is, if I'm a fund manager, if I'm depleting the capital of that fund and not generating funds to replenish that, then I'm not doing a very good job. And so it's the same with the natural capital. If we continue to deplete the underlying resource, then we're not doing a very good job. Now, this is, this is somewhat contentious in the way we use the language, and I realize that there's lots around this, but I struggle a bit with how to find the right terminology. But what we're seeing is this is really around investing and impact investing. I've used the term tradable commodities, and this is not what we normally think of when we look at natural capital. We generally think about the underlying base. What can we trade on that? We might trade agriculture. But in an intact ecosystem in particular, there's a lot that can be done with that. So even things like cultural heritage can be traded. It's a tradable commodity. It can be converted into an economic mechanism, whether through tourism, whether it's through philanthropy. Philanthropic funds can come in and help to generate more investment returns. Solar wind power is fairly straightforward. Biodiversity is an interesting one because we've got bonds associated with that. And I suppose if people are not familiar with bonds, we can talk about it later. I don't want to tell people things that they already know. The same with social and community development and these things. You can link bonds to the landscape. And again, I'll give some very clear examples of how Forever Wild is doing this. So really, the landscape is a mixed portfolio. For us, the way we see ourselves is that we are a fund manager. Fund is, the fund are the various properties that we have, and we think about how we can create revenues from those properties. And this comes into the model that we've got there. You'll see right down at the bottom, I've got small writing, and how do we measure it? You'll see this pop up through the presentation because it is really important to think about this right from the step one. And I will talk about it. I'm not just going to rush over it.
Fiachra, sorry to interrupt. We have a question in the chat. Someone would love to know if you could share some examples of bonds linked to landscapes and natural capital. Yeah, I can certainly do that. In fact, I have a little bit coming on later. I've got a slide where we talk about measurement. And in that measurement, we talk about some of the revenues that could come through there, how that would link back to a bond. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So as I was saying, if you look at this, basically, earlier I had the landscape as a form of natural capital. In many ways, if you look at the landscape as the fund, it can fund multiple values, and we can realize those values in lots of different ways. We have a reserve in North Queensland, for example, and when we talk about tourism, we have 3 different tourism operators on that reserve. All of them have very different models and very different products, but they all take place in the same landscape, and they all they really use that landscape to support their business units. Solar is probably what we'd call a constant form of natural capital, and I understand there's some flux. You might get months and months of a big wet season, so you got to be careful where you put your solar panels. But it is much more constant. It's not subject to the same kind of variables that you might have with the landscape. And as an investor, this becomes very important. You need to figure out what your risk threshold is and what sort of returns, financial returns you want, and what sort of impact you want. You can certainly link impact to solar. We know that that is a way that the world has to go. And you're probably more likely to be able to manage the risk associated with that investment. When you get into some of the other stuff, it would probably be well described as dynamic natural capital. If you look at the landscape, it is subject to multiple variables over which we have no control. When, like I said, with the pastoral example before, when the financial system attempts to control the variables or to control the outputs, the returns from that natural capital, there's a tension. And that tension can be considerable and can ultimately start to degrade the natural capital. So you're degrading your own capital fund that you're investing in. Now that's okay for many people. There's no question that people are willing to put in investment into intensive agriculture. That intensive agriculture may take an intact landscape, as it does in Latin America in many cases. An intact landscape completely alter, can change the function of that landscape. You can withdraw your returns, and you're really just converting that natural capital into financial revenue. There's no other values with that. And this is what some of the models are. So if you use
again, this is very, very, very simple. And I realize we don't have huge amounts of time. But if we use an asset, the investment model is the investor comes along, you might invest into an agricultural or solar or other company, and you effectively use the landscape or that natural capital as a commodity. You convert it into revenue, and that's fine. It actually works quite well and feeds many, many people. I'm not suggesting for a second that that is what there's not a role for that. There is. We have to understand that if you try and implement that system over these lovely intact landscapes and places where you have a lot of variability and ecological variability, that your fairly static economic system is not going to be a good fit. So we've got to think about how we can make that work. And you do get functional degradation, functional change in the natural capital, which degrades its long-term potential. If we look at it as a fund, if you look at capital as natural capital as a fund, we're probably more likely to be able to diversify the portfolio because we are assuming, we're working on the basis that we want to maintain the integrity of that natural capital fund. And out of that, we need to look at multiple different revenue streams. And if one particular revenue stream is not doing particularly well, it could be, that's again just agriculture, I'm going to say, because we're all familiar with that, we're all familiar with drought. Maybe we need to reduce what's happening in that particular business unit and look if we can expand other business units and how we can be creative. And this is the same principle as if it is an actual financial fund that I'm managing. So the management of the natural capital in that lower grade box down here really becomes, you think of the organization as a fund manager, and the institutional framework to do that is very important. You also get, with the capital funds, you start to get lots of different dynamics that you can play with. So where we have, in this case, I've got this slide up, and we're really looking at, I put them as investors, but you could have an impact investor that expects a return on investment, financial return. You could have a philanthropic entity, and they could share some of the outcomes, and they can share the risk. You've got to be careful, they don't necessarily subsidize an investor with philanthropic input, but you can certainly expand what you can do with that natural capital. You have a lot more leeway with how much you can experiment and explore because you're reducing the risk to the investor. You also get something interesting, which is off-site benefits. And this is something that we will be exploring in Western Australia, that, where we actually use the natural capital to leverage other programs which are not directly associated with that landscape, but they're in the small town, people come onto site, we create jobs and a number of other things. But I won't go too much into that. It's something we're currently exploring, and we're looking at how we would measure that. So, we look at, just a very quick overview, lots of different forms of natural capital, but we do need to think about the investment model quite differently so that we don't undermine the natural capital we're looking to invest in. Equity or debt, this is sort of an interesting question, and it really depends on what you're looking to invest in. If your tradable commodity, it says my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully, I'm still there. Yeah. If your tradable commodity is constant, I think you're probably in a fairly good position to have equity in a company or equity in whatever institution is managing that natural capital. If it's not constant, then if you've got equity in there, you do have, there's questions around risk. And I understand that with equity, you can help to manage some of your risk and you can sell off. This is where you convert the natural capital from a capital fund to an asset. Like, right, we're just going to sell the property, But you then have to question, in a bad time, if your investment is really, your returns are not looking that great, that's part of the natural flux, So part of the challenge with getting equity in there is that you get pressure to sell off that natural capital rather than wanting to ride it out with maybe a debt structure and wait till it comes back up again, or diversify your interests. So it's a bit of a mindset. We want to protect our planet and do so in a way which is sensible. We have to work with the planet. Okay, so the impact. This is this is obviously pretty important. I'll give you an example. There's a large pastoral lease in Western Australia where we have 2 properties at the moment. We've got one in North Queensland that we've been experimenting with for the last 2 years. And it's been quite successful, but it's at a small scale. And now we're looking to really scale up and look at different kinds of finance mechanisms and what type of investment, and whether there's pressure to get an investment back to someone, what does that look like? So one of the first things you need to do, if we're talking impact investment, is to look at the objectives. What are the objectives of that investment? It's not to get the best financial return, you know. And I know that there's a huge amount of pressure in marketing and you know, with impact investing firms, they talk about market rate return. We will get you a market rate return. And in many cases, they can, as long as they diversify. When you're looking at natural capital, it becomes tricky. You know, you've got to be careful. Again, I know I probably sound a broken record. Careful we don't try and force financial expectations onto a system which has lots of natural variability. But our objectives for this was to, as you see on the left-hand side of the screen, and the first thing we did was, when we talked about social development, we went in and spent 9 months in the landscape, in and out for 9 months, talking to people, understanding what they need, how the community functions, how do they interact with the community. If we really want social outcomes, we need to know what they need, and not go in and try and force a model on top of it. In this particular landscape, there are multiple ways to think about it. Now, somebody asked about bonds before. If you look down to the 4th point, there are social, community, indigenous health outcomes that we're looking at. And that could potentially be done through bonds. And that is something we're exploring, and it has been done before, where, you know, we're really, the investor or we would get paid to produce a measurable outcome. That measurable outcome, if it would cost the government $1 million to do that, we might be able to do it for 500,000. We might be able to do it for even less. So there's a long-term saving to the government. It's measurable. It's up to us, to put the program in place. Our institutional infrastructure is much less. Our overheads are much less for the same outcome as maybe a government-led program would be. So that's, you know, that is something which I think in Australia, and Camille maybe would know more about the development and where we sit with that. Maybe some of the listeners would know more about where we sit. There's been a few examples of social bonds in Australia. It's in Western Australia, this is a very new concept. So working with West Australian government, this is, it's almost like speaking another language at times.
Fiachra, sorry, I'll jump in again. Can you take a second to explain to our audience today how Forever Wild actually create this fund? Like, walk us through the steps that you had to take in WA, for example.
Okay, specifically for what? I missed the first part of your question.
For the work you did in WA.
Okay. So the work we did in WA, I'll just go back up here very quickly. We assessed the natural capital as a whole, and we as Forever Wild are really focused on intact landscapes. And there's a reason for that. There's a lot of work being done around restoring landscapes and trying to get carbon back into landscapes. But at a simple planetary systems level, if we want to try and reduce the level of global warming, we need to protect what we still have. So working in intact landscapes, relatively intact landscapes, is important for us. It's also a place from a business unit point of view, investment point of view. There are lots and lots of business units and lots of tradable commodities that we can leverage on that landscape. So we have multiple sites that we look at across Australia. We went in and we start looking at what is the cost of land, cost of acquisition, what would be the actual investment into these landscapes, and then we start to we have an entire structure in place where we start to map out the potential revenue streams, what we expect, what we think they'll expect is really each one goes into a bit of a business model with business canvas. How much we think we could do from a traditional, let's say, impact investment point of view. Do we need philanthropy with that to blend the investment? Now, we're a young organization. We don't have much revenue or cash flows. So at this early stage, for us, philanthropic input is helpful. It wouldn't say it's absolutely necessary. We try to structure so it's not. If we were just going down a philanthropic route, even though we're a charity, we're a charitable business, we're going to go down that route. We're limited by scale. Philanthropy is always going to be limited. We want to tap in. We want to compete with the big corporates out there who have a different mindset to us.
So in essence, so step one is identifying areas that need conservation, and then you develop a program that is all about protecting the landscape.
Step two is actually just to look at the social dynamics. So we use the Australian Bureau of Statistics. We look at social need and relative disadvantage, how we can contribute to that. We map that against our framework. And then we go into the landscape and start into the specific landscape. We've already been in WA for a while. The specific landscape, and really start talking to the people in the landscape, pastoral community, the local government, the Indigenous people. How do they see the landscape? How do they see us? And what do they think that we could do? And from there, we start to build out what our social development outcome could be. We've got an idea of the conservation outcome, and then we also look at livelihoods. What are people's expectations on livelihoods? What is it they want to do? And what do we think the landscape can sustain? So there's a whole framework to map that out.
Thank you.
And conservation agriculture is really important. It is a really important form of it's people's identity in that landscape. People would not want to see an organization coming in and taking lots of land and locking it up. They want the landscape to remain as a contributing force to their social well-being and to sustaining the community which they live in and are bonded to. So we got to figure out how to do that. And this is where the mapping comes out, objectives and the mapping against what you think you can achieve. I've got a little note down there just to remind myself, impact washing is sadly quite common in this area, and it's where there's grand claims about impact washing, and you see it quite a lot where people will talk about their activity and they'll have better soil health outcomes, better soil biodiversity. Oh, I'm sorry, but that's just good practice. That's not an impact. If you want to run a sustainable and long-term, food production initiatives, then good soil is a requirement. So carbon is a very important thing for us. We wanted to maintain a degree of carbon, make sure that it's permanent. It's a very small amount of carbon relative to the amount we need to draw down in the world. I know we had carbon in there to talk about, but carbon is a whole area. It really is a whole area to talk about. And it is a dynamic form of natural capital. So it is not always going to give you the same returns as a model predicts. There's a risk associated with it. You might lose that carbon in a big fire. You might lose it through other mechanisms. You've got to figure out how you're going to trade it and if you're going to trade it. For us, it is important. We do want to trade it, but we've also tried to offset it with lots of other revenue streams, so that if we don't get the return that we hope, we're thinking of the landscape as a fund with lots of business units on it. Conservation, is often put out there. Again, how do we measure it? We know what's out there. This is a small list, a small example on this particular property. There's a lot that can be achieved. Again, we've got to figure out how to manage it. And this is an interesting one. This is actually a tradable commodity. There's early European history. We've identified that there are people out there who are willing in different ways to pay for exposure and experience to this a particular experience, and it can be done through different ways. And so while it is for everyone and everyone can access it, there are ways we can leverage this. It's about thinking creatively. What can the landscape provide, and how can we convert that into a tradable commodity without degrading it? So just to finish off, how do you measure impact? So if you cycle back to the objectives, what is the objective of the investment? Really, what are you trying to achieve? And you have to think about, whether it's purely ecological, social, a blend of, is it an ESG investment? What's the governance behind that? You need a theory of change. You've got to, when you deal with natural capital, which is a complex area, you need to understand what it is you're going to you need to understand what it is. Sorry, the screen keeps flicking at me as a host. You understand how you're going to get from point A to point B. You need a measurement framework. This is an area, there's a lot of work to do in Australia. You know, we've been lucky, we worked with Ernst & Young last year, we put a lot of time in. We have our own measurement framework. A lot of it's probably applicable. And you need, I believe that somebody needs to be able to independently verify, because we don't have time to stuff around. We really don't have time for grand statements and claims about impact that we're having, because time is short for us on this planet. And we need to make sure that the model, coming back to the investment model, the return on investment, financial return, is not driving any form of negative functional change in the landscape. So for us, when we look at what we've got, this is just a small snapshot of what we do with Ernst & Young. You see this part I haven't put in. There's a lot to it. It's about 10, 12 pages long. You know, you've got activities. There's lots of different forms of activities in the wilderness program. For a while, this is a fund manager, if you like. We're a fund manager of natural capital, and we can do lots of things. We contract out to different specialist organizations. We're not an agricultural specialist or tourism specialist. We find those people and pull it all together to get a return on investment. We look at what the long-term, short-term to long-term outcomes are, and we have very clear material outcomes and material stakeholders. And all of this is underpinned by the natural capital. In our case, we're really looking at landscapes and the diversity of opportunity in landscapes. So we are very much involved in the dynamic natural capital. And that's why it's taken so much work to try and build a model that can allow the ecological variables to persist and not to be overridden. I put the agriculture up there in the first slide. I think everyone is more familiar with that, but actually we have a large program, which is the Human Spirit Program. If you look across the top there, whoever's interested in bonds, across the top and the bottom, you can see that there are outcomes which are measurable. We have a measurement framework for all of these things. Some of these long-term outcomes are developed, they're co-designed with the community. Something I'm sure everyone's familiar with is that Indigenous Australians have a very strong connection to land, spiritual and cultural connections to land. There are a lot of other people that have connections to land as well in different forms. And this is measurable. It really is measurable. There are ways that we can develop programs around natural capital for social cohesion. On the Tropical Wetlands Reserve, for example, we work with a specialist partner, and they run lots of different Indigenous-based programs. We've had Strong Women, Strong Families Days. We've had Indigenous Men's Days, Youth Justice Days. And we don't run it. We just cover the public liability insurance and allow these guys to run it. And there's a number of different ways that we can monetize that, including through government frameworks. You know, the outcomes from these activities and to the implementing partner. Just a very quick summary. I suppose I did speak for 45 minutes, Camille. I didn't think I would. There you go, like rabbiting on.
Passion has taken over.
It's my last slide, but just it's a very quick summary. The first thing really is an impact investment need, or is it just an investment? And this is to try and get away from the, every man and his dog is claiming impact investment these days. Make sure there is an impact investment. That's what you want. Environmental, you got to understand the natural capital. You need to map it out with a framework and look at your investment model so that you choose the right model that is not going to damage the natural capital. Social, you got to work with the community. It's not that hard to do, but it does take time and initial investment to do that. But you're not going to get a return on that immediately, so there's a longer time span. Governance there, really, I think we need to move to an area where there are organizations that are effectively fund managers for natural capital. They can look at a piece of land, they can protect all the values that it holds for multiple people and the environment, and they can think creatively about how to bring in revenue, protect that. The spin-off of that is that you get much broader social and political license. We're not going in saying it is only for this purpose. It is only for conservation. That's fine, but that's not viable at a very large scale. We've got to figure out how we can really blend, human society and our natural systems together. And then grab a cup of tea and sit down and, pat yourself on the back. Job well done.
Thank you so much. Fabulous. Great talk.
That's it. I'll leave you with that slide. Not that I want to be negative. I think it's important that we look forward and how we do stuff, but that is really just to give you a little bit of urgency that we've got to figure out how this is. Talking about it a long time, we've got to make it happen.
Thank you so much. Really inspiring and lots of great insights. Thank you so much. I'm sure a lot of people will want to look at these slides again. Fiachra, we had a few questions in the chat, so I'm gonna start asking you some of them, if you don't mind. So
sure.
Dennis asked, do you think there is any difference between the older terminology natural capital and the modern phrase ecological/economic system services? So again, going back to what we've discussed at the beginning of this webinar, the terminology and the fact that it might be important to understand what terms we use and who.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Unfortunately, what we tend to see, not just in this area, but just generally speaking, is that terms get co-opted. And I think the words ecosystem services has been co-opted for multiple things. And you now find it across all sorts of different, if we just stick to land, for example, all sorts of different land uses. And people can unfortunately frame, it's the same with impact investing. People can frame the terminology with a great narrative to suit what they believe is or they want to believe is appropriate. And that's why I'm not saying we necessarily got it right, and I'm not saying that we, are leading the field by any means. There's a lot of room for improvement, but we spent a lot of time. We spent 2 years just developing the framework so that anyone can come in independently and verify what we're saying, and that we are actually having the impact that we say we're having, and that is meaningful. The impact has to be meaningful. So I think that in some ways, it doesn't really matter what terminology we use, as long as we can be consistent and it doesn't get co-opted, or we have a way for somebody to come and say, oh, I'm not sure about that, let me check against some sort of standards. And I know there's a lot of work done around standardization in impact investing.
Thank you, and you're right. I think you have created a blueprint for people to consider how important it is to have proper measurement in place. And I love the transparency you have around your model, to the point of being audited by external parties. I mean, this is wonderful transparency. So yeah, well done. We have a great question from David. So David asks, what's the path for greater recognition of natural capital on company balance sheets and in national accounts via accounting standards, sustainable development goals? Should we modernize statistics to incorporate sustainability? What are your thoughts?
Oh, that's a good question. Wow, can we go to some bad questions? Like what time?
David's an expert, so yeah.
That's a great question. I mean, the SDGs are great. I think that they, as you really get down into the SDGs, you've got to pull them apart. You've got to tease them apart to make them really meaningful. Some of them are quite broad. Climate action, I forget which one that is exactly, but it's pretty broad. So you really got to fit down into it. I mean, I think, the accounting standards, I have to say, I'm not sure how that would really lock in. When I talk about accounting standards, it's generally with the auditor. They want auditors just from a financial point of view. But that's an interesting question, and I think that there's some interesting room. I probably never really thought about it much. There's really some room for discussion around that. How do we get it on company balance sheets? Because I do know, I think I know where the question's coming from. There's a lot of talk, again, a lot of talk around sustainable, company practices, but it's not necessarily standardized. It's not verifiable. I would think that maybe the one that's best known would be the SDGs, and maybe that could be a platform and a template to develop company standards and company accounting towards what we really need in sustainable practice. But yeah, I think for me that's really a discussion point. I don't have a firm answer.
There is also, Fiachra, there is also this concept of true accounting. I know a fabulous company here in Brisbane called Food Connect, and they do report on their financials, of course, but they also have another accounting system that reports on their impact. So impact of their on the communities, impact on the environment. So they've developed a system around a new way to do accounting. There's lots of good ideas out there. But yeah, I think David's question point a really good topic around how do we develop some consistency to drive this impact forward and framework. There's a lot of good work as well in Europe around taxonomy and what green investing means, but that's an entire other topic for another day. We have other good questions, so I'm going to keep going and read them to you. Someone asked, what government policy changes do we need to do to better enable investments in natural capital?
Oh, well, I mean, I think, the first one is that we need to go back to Canberra with our COVID-19 team looking at economic, recovery in Australia and really look at, there's obviously a lot of contentious discussion around gas development, fossil fuels. I mean, that to me is just a standout area. It's a standout policy change that can be made immediately. And this is a great time. We should use this opportunity and really talk about it. I know there's a lot happening in the world stage right now, but that task force that met, I think it's just absolutely scandalous, and they're just overlooking some very significant opportunities for Australia and placing ourselves in a policy leadership role, and also just for the future of generations to come. So that probably feeds down into then policies that will come out of this task force. I worry that the COVID-19 is going to be used as a springboard to push forward policies and investment areas which we really should be moving away from.
I couldn't agree more, and I encourage our audience today to have a look at the Clean Energy Council, who has released recently some propositions around supporting the clean energy transition with COVID-19 packages, and how that would translate into lots of opportunities such as jobs, but also economical prosperity for us all here in Australia. So it's a really important topic, and we need to be really knowledgeable about it. We have probably 5 more minutes until I wrap up. So I encourage everyone to think about one last question if you have any. Otherwise, I will just finish this web. Oh, I think Dennis is raising his hand. Go for it, Dennis.
Look, in relation to natural capital, of course, the term was changed largely because people didn't like the word capital. Ecosystem services, or a combination of economics and ecology, of course, was a kind of way of satisfying the move away from the more theoretical construct within, broadly speaking, the environment movement. And ecological services probably became public only about 4 years ago, and we and Cairns have been active in the Cape, and probably Fiachra knows this already, but ecological system services as a way of trying to get income from Cape York has been something that was developed by my treasurer, vice president at CAFNEC, Luke Priest, and his fellow academic Penny van Oosterlies. For those of you who are interested, you can actually get that article on ecological system services off the Conversation. If you go into the search and put Cape York ecosystem services are worth billions of dollars, as a way of actually finding out what the current thinking is. It's not current actually, it's a bit out of date now, it's a few years old, but the thinking is around moving towards a way in which we can harness the riches of the Cape in a sustainable way. But I take Fiachra's point, we shift language and language then becomes something which is manipulable. We've seen it with greenwashing. You mentioned it with impact washing. Capital was changed, we didn't like it, we went to ecosystem services, some people don't like that. It's always a problem when a word or a phrase is appropriated for malintent.
Yeah, that's true, Dennis, and I'm really passionate about that. And this is why we do these webinars, to share some definitions about what those terms mean, so that people can see good intent from greenwashing, hopefully. I'm conscious of time. We are reaching the end of the webinar. Fiachra, if you want to wrap up with some final thoughts, and then I'll give an update on the group and the future webinars.
Great, thanks, Camille. Not much final thoughts. Time for a cup of tea, I think. And yeah, just thanks very much. I think this is, you know, so this is more of a discussion. You know, I feel like, you know, a bit odd up here presenting. We have our own ideas and our own pathway, and I think we've done a lot of work. But certainly, this is an area that needs input and discussion, and we've got to figure this out for a broad scale.
Sure.
Pretty quickly, and take some risks. I think investors and impact investing firms need to be prepared to take some risks and experiment.
Yeah, and think long term. Yeah, I encourage everyone to have a look at Forever Wild website and subscribe to their newsletters if you want to see more of those beautiful images of Australia. I'm certainly quite passionate about those wilderness images. So please have a look at Forever Wild. You can also participate. You can actually invest in some of the programs that we've described today, and it is very accessible. So please check it out and support Fiachra in his work. Fiachra, thank you so much for your insights. Great chat today, and lots of good content. I'm really looking forward to sharing your slides with this group. I will simply close this webinar by saying that please stay with me. There will be more of these webinars. On the 23rd of June, please join me for a great session on superannuation. So we're going to talk about how to use your super to make a positive impact. And I have the great pleasure to invite Future Super founder Adam Verwey to talk about how we can all make a big impact by just looking at where our super is invested. So there's no doubt it will be a great chat. If you know anyone who would benefit from these webinars, I would really appreciate if you could share and if you could invite your colleagues or people who could contribute to the discussion. My goal is to grow this group into a wonderful tribe of people who really want to make an impact and want to drive change. So please share, and I'm always welcome to any suggestions. So if there are some topics that you would love to talk about, if you want to present and share your thoughts on one topic related to impact investing or sustainable finance, please send me an email and let me know. I think that's all for today. Fiachra, just so you know, there's lots of thank yous in the chat. So everyone, I think, really enjoyed your talk. So thank you again.
Thanks very much.
And yeah, have a fantastic week, everyone. I hope to see you all next week on the 23rd to talk about super and how we can all make a good impact. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.